Armenian Apocryphal literature of the Old Testament in the 20th century. The present paper will discuss the study of the Armenian Apocryphal literature of the Old Testament during the last century. Prior to the last decade of the 19th century, the Armenian Old Testament Apocrypha were not studied at all, and scarcely even published. As in so many fields of Armenian studies, it was the Mechitorist fathers who laid the systematic foundations, and in 1896 Father Sarkis Hovsepian published the first collection of such works in his Anganon Kirkin Gedagaranat, non-canonical books of the Old Testament. This collection was followed in the subsequent decades by two complementary publications, Father Barser Sarkisian's Ուսումնասիրություն Քին Գդագարանի Անվավեր Քրոց Վրա, Studies on the Uncanonical Books of the Old Testament in 1898, and in 1901 by Father Jacques Isaverdens, The Uncanonical Writings of the Old Testament. Sarkisian's studies and Isaverdens' uncanonical writings were both based upon Hovsepian's collection. During the latter part of the 19th century, interest in the apocryphal literature in various languages grew, basically stimulated by New Testament studies, and in particular by the attempt to understand Jesus' life and preaching in its historical context. This movement of scholarship culminated in the publication of major collections of Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha in German by Emil Couch in 1900 and in English by R.H. Charles in 1913. It is in this context that Hovsepian's collection of texts, Sarkisian's studies, and Isaverdens' English translations should be viewed. This same movement led to other studies of the Armenian apocryphal literature, particularly by British and French Armenisons such as Conybeare and Maclear. The work of the Mechitorists during the 19th century bore fruit as non-Armenian scholars worked on these Armenian texts. Little was written by Armenian scholars on apocryphal texts at that time, though some works will be noted below. A further factor that stimulated and enriched the study of the Armenian Apocrypha was the publication of catalogues of Armenian manuscript collections. This had started much earlier, but the magistral work of Jacobus Dashian, the first volume of the catalogue of the Library of the Vienna Mechitorists, spurred a movement that is still underway. Since Dashian gave incipits and references to published works, students of the Armenian Apocrypha suddenly had many sources available. The catalogues prepared by Maclear of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, by Conybeare of the British Museum, by Baronian and Conybeare of the Bodleian, by Fink and Janscherzian of Tübingen University Library, by Sarkisian of the Venice Mechitorists, and others contributed to this movement. Categories and issues. The very terminology used for the literature was also problematic. Protestants readily called all books that were in the Vulgate and not in the Hebrew Bible by the name Apocrypha, and all broadly similar books dealing with Old Testament themes, Pseudepigrapha. The Apocrypha were called deuterocanonical by the Latin Church and were mostly included in the biblical canon, though the Council of Trent in the 16th century excluded one or two works. The scriptural canon of the Armenian Apostolic Church is much less definitely defined, but includes most of the so-called deuterocanonical works. This matter was studied by Movsesian in his Russian History of the Armenian Bible, where he published a number of Armenian lists of canonical works, and by Theodor Zahn in his great studies of the New Testament canon in 1893. The Mechitorist treatment of the canon was governed by the principles of the Church of Rome, and so Zohrab's Bible of 1805 was structured according to the decisions enunciated at Trent. The present study does not treat the deuterocanonical works that are part of the Armenian Bible. Thus, we do not discuss the studies of Turian on Syriac, of Benvenot, Kogyan, Thompson, and Amalian on Maccabees, and a few others. The discussion of these belongs properly in the ambit of the study of the Armenian Bible. Yet the borders of the Armenian canon remain somewhat unclear, and to this day there is no modern printing of the ancient Armenian Bible and the collection officially sanctioned by the Armenian Apostolic Church. Thus, the matter of canon remained rather confused for most of the 20th century. Between 1973 and 2001, 6 articles presenting Armenian canon lists with English translations were published. These provided the beginning of a sounder basis for studying the issue. In the context of a consultation on the New Testament canon, the speaker attempted to formulate some principles categorizing chief categories of apocryphal literature as they were reflected in the canon lists. The Catalogue of Armenian Biblical Manuscripts, published by the late Archbishop Shahir Ajemian, contributed greatly to achieving a clearer and more detailed view of the relationship between the books listed in Armenian canon lists and the actual contents of manuscript Bibles. Ajamian's catalogue lists in full all the contents of all Armenian biblical manuscripts, and so gives a detailed picture of the books they include. It became clear early on in this study that the Armenian Church had rarely turned its official attention to the issue of canon and apocrypha. It had been of interest to medieval scholars and is reflected at some points in the liturgy, but only once was the subject of an Armenian conciliar decision at the Council of Bartav in 768, and the list approved there was in any case translated from Greek. At the present juncture, the most useful categories are: 1. Works associated with the biblical corpus. These works occur mainly or exclusively in biblical manuscripts and are almost never included in the Armenian canon lists or canonical usage. Such books are Joseph and Asenath, 4th Ezra, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Lives of the Prophets, Psalm 151. Other works occur occasionally in biblical manuscripts, but their status is more or less tenuous. Thus, the history of Joseph is not infrequently associated with Joseph and Asenath. Second category, Apocrypha translated from other languages into Armenian but not included in the above biblically associated category. An example of such a work is the Questions of the Queen and the Answers of King Solomon, of which the Syriac original was discovered only a short time ago. Third, apocryphal works composed in Armenian on Old Testament themes, which take their structure, form, and character from the tradition of apocryphal narratives. Fourth, associated works that are related to the scholarly study of the Bible as was cultivated among the Armenians. Such works are predominantly lists related to the biblical text and also elenchic works in which apocryphal traditions are embedded. Hovsepian's, I'm going to talk about Hovsepian's. Hovsepian's collection included works that occurred in Armenian biblical manuscripts, such as Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs and 4th Ezra, translated works such as the Questions of the Queen and the Answers of King Solomon and the Paralipomena of Jeremiah, and works that were in all likelihood composed in Armenian, such as the Vision of Enoch and the Short History of Elijah. The collection was far from exhaustive, but it was most significant and had considerable impact. The English scholar Montague Road James, for example, discussed it at some length in his 1899 collection called Apocrypha Anecdota, in the second volume, pages 158 to 165, while the German scholar Preußen studied the corpus of Adamic Apocrypha, translated them into German, and characterized them mistakenly as Gnostic. F.C. Conybeare, a formidable scholar, also turned his attention to the apocryphal literature. He wrote articles on the Armenian versions of such apocrypha as Apocalypse of Moses and Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. R.H. Charles included data from Armenian manuscripts in the apparatus of his Editio Major of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. The early work of the French Armenologist Frédéric Macler included a number of writings devoted to the Danielic literature. This list of early scholars of the Armenian Old Testament Apocrypha could be expanded, but not very extensively, as a consultation of Robert Thompson's bibliography shows. The only work devoted to an edition and translation of and notes on an apocryphal apocalypse is Kalem Karian's edition and German translation of the seventh vision of Daniel. Summary. After the work of the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, little was done in the study of the Armenian Apocrypha until after the middle of this last century. The first half of the century had taken up only part of the challenge extended by the work of the three Venice Mechiterists, Hovsepian, Sarkisian, and Isaverdens. Certain of those apocrypha close to the biblical corpus were subjects of some attention. This was particularly true of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, the short Armenian recension of which Charles had claimed to be more original than the surviving Greek. He was wrong, but that doesn't matter. Similarly, the Adam books had been studied, in particular the text of the Book of Adam or Apocalypse of Moses by Conybeare. Of the works composed in Armenian, only two were studied, the Apocryphal Adam books by Preußen and the Seventh Vision of Daniel by Kalem Karian, second half century. There's been a notable change in the study of the Armenian Apocrypha during the past half century. This change reflects a very considerable advance on the first 50 years' work, but the advance that has been made is still far from responding to all the questions raised about the field. Scholars of apocryphal literature very often come from biblical studies, and that is frequently the case as regards the Armenian Apocrypha as well. This benefited in particular the standards and modes of textual editions. In addition, some interest has arisen in the growth and development of apocryphal traditions within the Armenian literary and religious tradition, and biblical scholars were not always the best equipped to pursue this line of inquiry. First then, editions and techniques. Very striking is the work that has been done on the edition of texts and the high level of some of that work. Scholars have undertaken sophisticated, critical and carefully planned diplomatic editions of a number of apocrypha which are closely related to the biblical corpus. These editions are either already completed or presently underway and have been prepared by Burchard and Stone. They are of three works, Joseph and Asenath, 4th Ezra, and Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Burchard has published a number of articles and has now finished preparing a critical edition of the Armenian version of Joseph and Asenath, which is currently in press. It is based on a careful study of all the manuscripts available and collation and preparation of an apparatus criticus. Burchard carried out this work alongside his study of the Greek text of Joseph and Asenath, and was thus able to place the Armenian within the context of the overall textual tradition of that work. These characteristics of Burchard's work also typify the study of other apocrypha and of some of the editions of biblical texts published at the same time. This is a meeting between the tradition of biblical textual scholarship and that of the Armenian Apocrypha, which has made the study of the Armenian Apocrypha part of modern textual studies. In the late 1960s, Stone had begun work on the text of two Apocrypha, 4th Ezra and Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. His work on Armenian 4th Ezra, undertaken in connection with a major commentary he was preparing on that work, resulted in 3 books. The first was a computer-generated concordance, which has the distinction of being the first computer-assisted study of any Armenian text. A full critical edition of 4th Ezra, based on all but one of the known manuscripts, appeared in 1979. In 1990, he published his textual commentary on the Armenian version of 4th Ezra, in which work, assembled in the course of the preparation of the edition, he set forth the basis of the textual decisions made in the edition. As far as the Armenian edition of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs is concerned, the work has progressed in fits and starts. After the work of Conybeare and Charles at the beginning of the 20th century, in the late 1960s, Burchard wrote an overview of the textual situation of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs that actually grew out of his work on Joseph and Asenath. This article related the textual tradition of the Testaments to that of Joseph and Asenath. The work of M. de Jonge a little earlier on the Armenian text showed that the prior view of the primacy of the short Armenian recension espoused by R. H. Charles and others was incorrect. Based on his conclusions, I have worked on and off for many years on the preparation of an edition, publishing preliminary text of Testament of Levi in 1969 and Testament of Joseph in 1975. A number of articles over the decades set forth the methodology used for selection of manuscripts to serve as the basis of an editio minor of the whole work, as well as a continued updating of the list of manuscript copies. I am able to announce here that the preparation of the editio minor is well underway and is scheduled to be completed by the end of next year. The discovery of an epitome of the Testaments in a manuscript of the year 981 took the direct witness to the Armenian translation back to a very early date. In addition, some further witnesses to and collations of the works already published by Hovsepians were assembled. Lowndes Lipscomb, in his doctoral thesis, re-edited the Adamic literature that Hovsepians had included, adding new manuscripts and a translation. In his introduction, he dealt with a number of substantial issues of this corpus of texts, which Stone had previously studied. In the earlier part of the century, Lütke had shown that this group of Armenian Apocrypha, which in my opinion were probably composed in Armenian, was also translated into Georgian. Stone and Kazazian published one of the homiletic pieces that are found in some manuscripts of these writings. In a paper published in 1978, Lipscomb discussed an Armenian text that may ultimately have derived from Jubilees. In the study of Sepiance's Adam books, which had much earlier caught Preußen's interest, we see a beginning of the study of the Armenian Apocrypha which were not associated with the Bible. If we were to catalogue all the texts that have been discussed in the past 30 or 40 years, and to list those whose existence is known but which have not yet been studied, the rest of the time allotted to this paper would be filled to overflowing. Some of this labour has now been done, and other aspects of it remain for the future. Instead, I wish to make a number of points that have arisen from the admittedly still inadequate study of the Apocrypha composed in Armenian, or from the reworkings of Apocrypha translated into Armenian. The editorial work done on Joseph and Asenath, on the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and on 4th Ezra has really addressed issues in the general study of the Old Testament Apocrypha, and particularly of their Greek texts. These issues are significant, and moreover, these works form the basis of Armenian literature, part of the basis of Armenian literature, since they are closely associated with the biblical corpus. It is most desirable that the labour of textual edition continue and be refined. I myself have found that Peter Robinson's program Collate is most helpful in this work. This work is by nature painstaking and time-consuming, and on occasions totally boring. The standards of edition set by the editors of Old Testament texts in particular should continue to be extended to the Apocrypha. Indeed, By the way, it may be remarked that more methodological self-consciousness in editorial techniques would be most desirable. There are, without any doubt, further translated Apocrypha that should be studied and edited. As desiderata, we may include definitive editions of Lives of the Prophets and of Questions of the Queen and Answers of King Solomon, among others. In the course of the study of Armenian manuscripts, even more such works may be discovered. These works, known and unknown, will conform a considerable contribution to the overall study of the Apocrypha of the Old Testament, and a very worthwhile one. The Apocrypha in the Armenian tradition. The project undertaken in recent years relating to the Adam literature has, however, been the realization of another aspect of Armenian apocryphal studies. I made a sustained attempt to assemble all works and passages in Armenian devoted to Adam and Eve. The reasons for this undertaking were: one, part of this literature had already received attention from Hovsepian's, Preußen, and Lipscomb. Two, other works were known by name or incipit, and I desired to get a fuller picture of Armenian creativity in this respect. Third, the number of Armenian documents relating to Adam and Eve already runs to over 50, so it's a major topic. Fourth, these apocryphal interpretations of the Adam and Eve stories had a major influence on theological life and literary productivity. I am convinced that the stories of Adam and Eve were normally read by Armenians not as tales of the first human couple or simply through the perspective of Historia Sacra leading from first Adam to the last Adam, but also typologically as presaging the life of Christ and salvation through him. Here we touch on an important point, and one that should be stressed. Once the Apocrypha became part of Christian literature, and this happened very early, from the perspective of their functioning in the context of Christianity, in fact, distinctions between Jewish Apocrypha and Christian, between Old Testament Apocrypha and New Testament Apocrypha, had no real relevance. The whole was understood as part of the history of salvation through Christ and of redemption. Even works that were originally Jewish were understood in this way. The tracing of the influence of the Adam Apocrypha in Armenian led to a series of aspects of Armenian culture. On the one hand, poets like Hovhannes Tilkuransi and Hovhannes Yerzinkatsi retold Adam tales using elements drawn from the apocryphal traditions. A major work of Armenian medieval literature, the Adam Kirk of the 15th century poet Arakel Syunetsi, incorporates many elements from the Adam Apocrypha. Retellings of biblical literature and popular traditions, such as those recorded about certain holy places in Jerusalem by Mugurtich Arav Nuni and others, all incorporate ideas, images, and even specific details drawn from the Adam Apocrypha. It is possible to explicate even more the ways in which this apocryphal literary tradition has penetrated Armenian culture. The Apocrypha, composed in Armenian, taking their start from the biblical text, developed under the influence of more ancient apocryphal works that were domesticated in the Armenian tradition. The perception of this rich heritage makes the task of uncovering it, learning it, and tracing it of the highest priority.